Hello, my name is Dr. Jonathan Dalton. I'm a licensed psychologist in Maryland, and I specialize in helping kids who are dealing with anxiety-based school avoidance and of course, their families as well. Carroll County Public Schools has asked me to record a half an hour of my thoughts and my experience in order to help the families who were confronted with this issue. And many families are dealing with this. And I always say that the more compassionate the parent is, the more vulnerable they are for accidentally doing the wrong things when they're helping their kid who's dealing with this issue. So it's really important that we talk about a lot of really counterintuitive things that help families deal with this issue effectively. And I will say as a disclaimer, as we get started here, and it's an important one, that this, of course, is not treatment itself. It's not a substitute for an evaluation from a mental health perspective. And that this is something that applies to the majority of kids, but not to every kids. In particular, this does not apply to kids who are actively suicidal or kids who are dealing with psychosis. And so please think of this as an introduction to go over some very basic skills and some very basic data on what's going on out there with the level of anxiety in our communities and the way it's impacting our education. And please make sure you are using this in concert with a trained mental health professional. So I'll be sharing my screen here. We'll be talking for about a half an hour or so. And what I want to talk about is, first of all, anxiety itself. Is that it's a package deal, and you know, it's not a weakness, it's not a flaw. I always joke that if you have a kid who's creative, who's compassionate, who is intelligent, the universe will go ahead and throw anxiety in for free. It really is this package deal. And so rather than being a flaw or a weakness, in reality, it's a shadow cast by these great virtues. And the great news is that anxiety is very treatable, even if it's been longstanding. We have really strong evidence-based programs of treatment that are effective for the vast majority of kids. And the great news with that is that when we can successfully reduce the anxiety, these great virtues can remain fully intact, and the kids are better off for having gone through the experience. They have, for instance, learned how to overrule fear as a decision-making tool. They have learned how to pursue their values rather than pursuing their comfort. And so we're going to be talking today about how this intersects with avoidance and how school avoidance is simply the furthest most example of the way that anxiety leads to avoidance. So the very first thing that I want to talk about is the difference between, and it's an important difference, between anxiety and anxiety disorders. So anxiety itself is really healthy and appropriate. It's something that's really important for our survival. It keeps us safe. Where pain says, stop doing this thing because you're damaging your body, anxiety and fear say, hey, don't do that thing because you may damage your body. If it's like an effective alarm system, which we know it's designed to be, it will go off when it's supposed to, and it won't when it's not supposed to. The other part of it is that it will prevent us from repeating mistakes. And so if we have been somewhere and we got very sick, hurt, or scared while we were doing something there, we will learn never to do that thing ever again. And think about food poisoning. If you ever had food poisoning after you ate something you previously really enjoyed, you will understand the power of that conditioning experience, and you'll never forget what was going on in that moment. It'll be stored differently in our brain, as a matter of fact. What makes anxiety become disordered is not the intensity of the anxiety that someone's feeling. Even professionals sometimes get that wrong. If you're in a dangerous situation, I really want you to be very anxious because you won't get distracted. You'll keep your eyes on what is the threat in the environment, and you're more likely to be safe at the end of it. What makes an anxiety become disordered is the fact that it's fundamentally a false alarm, where the fear is real, but the danger is not. And the challenge with that is that we can't tell, for instance, if we burn our toast or the curtains are on fire based on the sound of the smoke alarm in our kitchen. And the same thing is true with our anxiety alarm. When it goes off, it's either on or it's off. And so because of that, we as humans tend to fall back on what I call our default factory settings that think of anxiety as nature's stop sign. And so that's a really effective response if you're in a very dangerous situation. Stopping what you're doing is exactly the right thing. But when the fear is real, but the danger is not, and you still avoid, that leads to this unnecessary avoidance. And in those two words is what people like me target in the work that we love to do. And so the great news about that is, and this is the number one take home from today's talk, is how when we avoid things that are not dangerous, we can learn different ways of responding to it. But if we don't, we are in essence firing the best teacher we will ever have in our lifetime, which is our own experience that would have taught us that while the fear was real, the danger never was. And so we think of avoidance as the lifeblood, so to speak, of anxiety disorders. And our approach is to help kids to reduce their use of avoidance as a way to regulate their emotions. And when that happens, when kids learn, the term we use is called non-avoidant coping skills, two really important things happen. Number one is they learn that while they were very afraid of that thing, it actually wasn't dangerous, that their perception of risk was greatly exaggerated. But perhaps most importantly, they are learning that they can handle the experience of anxiety itself. And so when I always joke that I run an anxiety treatment center, but I don't treat anxiety itself. I don't have to. Anxiety is two things. Anxiety itself is temporary and harmless. What I treat is avoidance, and it can ruin lives. Now, the great news is that when we can effectively reduce the anxiety, when we can effectively reduce the avoidance, the anxiety will diminish naturally, all by itself. Think of it like slowly taking away oxygen from a fire in the fireplace. Even if you never touch the flames, they will slowly go out because they're not getting what they need to survive. And so our goal here is to teach people a different way of responding to their own internal stop sign that goes off when they're having this false alarm of an anxiety disorder. And so we're talking about that a great deal, but that's the number one take home again today, is the idea that anxiety and avoidance are teammates. Okay, they work on the same side. And school avoidance is just the furthest example. It's the most extreme manifestation of this urge to avoid, when a child is avoiding kind of the fundamental responsibility of childhood, which is learning, going to school and receiving an education. And so almost everyone, when they come in to see me, they have basically the same question. How do I get rid of the anxiety so my child can go back to school? And I always joke that's like saying I'd love to go to the gym, but I want to get in shape first. Returning to school is not the outcome of anxiety reduction. It's the mechanism through which we reduce the anxiety. The confrontation with fear, persistence in the presence of distress, in a slow, gradual way, of course. We're not going to do a cannonball off the high dive. We're going to be dipping our toes in the pool and slowly getting deeper. But the whole idea here is that we can reduce anxiety by reducing avoidance. And so let's talk now about some very, very specific strategies when it comes to getting kids back into school. And our recommended path in almost all cases is rapid re-entry in a graduated format, which means that we work to get the kids back in quickly, but at the same time, doing one small bit at a time and helping them until they're able to spend the whole day in school. So as we're talking about this concept of school refusal or school avoidance, it's known by two different names. And the reasons why we care so much about helping the kids who are dealing with this is that it's not really about the school. I mean, of course it is to some degree, and it makes complete sense that if you have a kid who's not going to school, then it's going to lower their learning level. It's going to reduce their academic achievement. Of course, because if you're not in school, that's what happens. But we also know that what's really happening is that the kids are practicing using avoidance as a way to deal with their feelings, with their emotions. And whatever we practice, we get really good at. And so what we see with these kids who are avoiding school, in addition to the fact that they're not doing as well in school, which of course makes complete sense, we are seeing that this avoidant monster, if you want to call it that, it rears its head in multiple areas of their life over a long period of time. And so, for instance, we don't call it work refusal, we call it unemployment. And it's actually a big issue for these kids who aren't effectively treated, because they will go back to that same pattern of using avoidance as a way to deal with emotions. And we all know as we reach adulthood that sometimes work isn't so much fun, or we may be anxious or in distress. And we can really use other skills other than not going to work that day. We also know that kids who aren't effectively treated tend to have some family challenges when they're adults. And again, avoidance doesn't play well with effective relationships, whether that's in a marital relationship, partnership, or whether it is just in social relationships in general. And so the reality is that we care too much about these kids and their futures to be bystanders to watching them continue to have these challenges. Because again, yes, it's about school, but it's about so much more than school. These kids deserve to have the best future they can. And I'm not just talking about the educational aspects of this. So as we're going through the strategies and approaches that we're using here, it is just so important to understand that we're affecting these kids in many different ways for a very long time to come. Okay, so let's get into some details. So when a kid is avoiding school, I always liken that to an allergic reaction to a casserole. We can look at a kid who is missing school, and the behavior can look the same from kid to kid or situation to situation. But the reality is the kids are reacting to different things about being in school. And so it's really important that families work with professionals who can help them identify which ingredient in the casserole, so to speak, they're allergic to. For a lot of kids, especially younger kids, it could be separation from parents. It could be fear of bad things happening to parents or the kids while they're separated. For adolescents, we see a lot of social anxiety about kids who are afraid of being unmasked or being seen as weird or stupid in an environment that really scares them. We see kids who maybe are afraid of what if they get sick when they're in school, especially when it comes to the glorious topic of vomiting. No one wants to talk about that, but we see a lot of kids who are afraid of that across all of the years of education. And I could go on and on and on about many, many different fears that we see for these kids who are experiencing these challenges. But please work with an expert in school avoidance to help figure out what the ingredient they're allergic to is, because what we want and what we know to be effective is helping the kids to basically come in contact gradually with that ingredient they're really afraid of. And that's not school per se, it's often some aspect of being in school. And so it's really important that we work with the kids and we work with the families and the professionals involved, the school community, obviously, to help figure out what we call it the core fear. What is the fuel that's driving this school avoidance in this particular child? Okay, now we're going to talk about some very specific parenting strategies. And these are effective for anxiety overall, but specifically when it comes to school refusal. So number one, just for a minute, I want you in your mind to separate your kid who you love from their anxiety. Think of them as two different things right now. And I want you to imagine that their anxiety itself is a dog begging for food. Only it's not begging for food. It is begging for other things, though. It's begging for two things in particular: avoidance and attention. Now, when one of my dogs is begging for food, it could be really tempting to say, oh my goodness, you're ruining my dinner. Okay, fine, here's a big piece of my steak. Now go away and never beg again. But of course, we know instinctively the dog will leave just momentarily. And when it comes back, it'll come back and beg louder and longer because it's gotten what it wants the last time it did it. And so we all know that, but when it comes to anxious kids, especially school avoidant kids, This is what parents, the research shows 99% of us do. So we almost all get this wrong, which is that we will give kids a lot of attention when they're anxious, because that's what compassionate parents do. But when we think of our attention as our child, and this is true for teens too, our attention is their paycheck, that means you want to be exceptionally careful what you pay them for. So if you're giving a lot of attention to an anxious experience, or you are somehow kind of siding with the urge to avoid and saying, okay, this is really hard for you, we're going to let you skip this one, we're going to not do this, we're not going to have you go back to school right now, for instance. Well, we are then in essence feeding the dog and hoping it stops begging for food. And so this is, as I mentioned, very, very counterintuitive. And almost all of us as loving parents get this wrong. We don't know, unless we're trained, that reassurance actually makes things worse. I liken it to putting water on a grease fire. It seems like it would make sense, but all it does is kind of spread the flames around and make things worse. And so we want to try and do very different things other than giving a lot of attention to our kids when they're exhibiting a lot of anxiety. And we certainly want to lower what the researchers call family accommodation. We don't want to give the anxiety a lot of space, because it will grow to fill whatever space we give it. And so we'll be talking today about loving firmness and calm consistency, warmth plus expectations. We really want the kids to know that we love them and they can do hard things. We do not want to give a lot of reassurance to an anxious child, and we certainly don't want to, unless there's a crisis going on with safety, think that anxiety and school attendance are incompatible. We care too much about these kids to give the anxiety room to grow. Okay, let's talk about what I call anxiety's tricks. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of dogs. There's this concept that is really important to know that operates on every family. It operates on mine, it operates on yours. And there's a term for it, it's not important, but it's called a coercive behavior cycle. All it means is that something is going on where the two individuals, like a parent and a child, are kind of in the short term benefiting. We call that being reinforced in psychology terms for the same problem behavior. Okay, so let's think for a minute that if a kid is very anxious and they come into your bedroom on a Sunday night, for instance, well, they're going to want your attention. They're going to feel more comfortable when you are reassuring them. So their expressions of anxiety-based sufferings are going to go down. If we say to them, okay, I can see that school is really hard for you. Let's take some more days off. We'll try and get you in later. The kid's anxiety will reduce. Well, we know as parents that nothing hurts more than seeing our kids suffer. And so when our kids come to us and their kind of exhibition of anxiety, when they demonstrate that they're anxious, and we give them reassurance and we give them avoidance, then they're going to feel better in the short term. And guess what? So will we, because we're not seeing our kids in that state of distress anymore. And so when we work with anxious kids and their families, and even in every family, this process plays out. And so it's really important for parents to understand what's going on here, and that when we are lovingly firm with the kids and we're being warm to them, and we are having expectations for school attendance to be anxious and in school, that's the situation where it's going to feel worse in the short term, both for the kid and the parent. And what I'm asking parents is to take your discomfort and invest it, because it's going to pay off down the road in really, really significant ways. Let me share a story. A number of years ago, I was working with a high school girl, and she had missed over 2.5 years consecutively of high school. And I met her, and she was a great kid, but she was very shy, very socially anxious. In our second session, I gave her a sentence and I asked her to fill in the blank. And the sentence was, I can be anxious and blank at the same time. And she thought about it for a few minutes, and she got this really kind of firm look on her face. And I thought something was wrong. And I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "Yeah, I'm good." And she looked at me right in the eyes and she said, "I can be anxious and strong at the same time." And she was right. And she got back in the next week and ended up graduating on time. That's what we're looking for in a nutshell to help these kids who are struggling with anxiety-based school avoidance, is to be anxious and, or anxious during, or anxious while they're beginning this process of re-entry. And if a kid is doing meaningful, important things and they're experiencing anxiety along the way, that does not mean at all that anyone's doing anything wrong. Okay, I want you to think of experiencing anxiety as the kids are doing things that are important, basically as the equivalent of getting sweaty at the gym. All it means is you're getting a good workout. It does not mean you need to stop what you're doing or that anything is going awry. It simply means that we are pursuing our values, not pursuing our short-term comfort. And through that process, the kids learn again that the thing that they were afraid of is actually not dangerous. And more importantly, they learn that they themselves can handle the experience of anxiety. Okay, let's get into specifics of school re-entry. So this is hard, but it's essential. So the number one rule that we have, and we're not the only ones who do this, is that basically we're looking to remove competition for school attendance. So if a kid is not in school, they can't do anything at home that they wouldn't be allowed to do if they were at school. So they're not allowed to be on screens, whether it's video games or watching Netflix or TikToks on their phone. It means they're not going to be able to sleep in until noon. And I know that's really challenging. Believe me, I do. But we work towards that goal of eliminating all competition with school attendance. Now, the kids can get those things back. At the same time, they'd be returning home from school after a full day on days that they're in school, but never during school hours. Boredom is one of our best allies because the calculus in a child's mind, whether they're going to avoid school that day or they're going to attend school that day, is never based entirely on how anxious they are about being in school. It's also based on how attractive the alternative is. And if being home means really being bored with not a lot to do, it's actually much easier to get kids back into school. Now, I'll tell you some tricks that we use here. Again, this is hopefully in combination with ongoing therapy with a trained expert in school avoidance. But as we get a kid back into school, our goal is to, in the beginning, define school with quotation marks. It may be the parking lot. It may be touching the front door. It may be talking to someone in the front office. And then that's all they have to do on that day is whatever we are defining school attendance that day. Then they get to come home. And then at 3:30 or whatever time it might be, they can get access to their preferred activities. And then gradually over time, we increase what we're defining as school. So the first day it's parking lot, and then a couple of days later, it might be being in the front office. Then it may be meeting with a school counselor, school psychologist, PPW, someone like that. And then maybe pretty soon it'll be sitting in a classroom without having to do the work, but just sitting in the classroom during a class. And then we just gradually increase what those things we're calling school attendance is until they're fully back in school. And I know that I'm skipping over huge parts. This is an involved, complicated process. And I hear from families all the time how relentless and exhausting this process can be. But we start off with this first basic rule. And of course, the kids are going to protest. They're not going to love this idea of not doing their preferred activities during the day, but it is an essential part of the process of returning to school. Okay. So I mentioned screens and sleeping. It also means a lot of other things too. They can't listen to music. I don't want them reading pleasure books. They can absolutely read school books. I don't want them doing hobbies unless it's something like for a science fair project. I even really don't want people having a lot of reinforcing experiences with their family during the day. Parents should be very busy during the day. When the kids, it's after 3:30, great, talk with the kids all you want to, but during the day, a lot of anxious kids are highly reinforced by having a lot of interaction with their parents, and in particular. For some kids, it might even mean like not having the preferred snack foods during the day. We're basically trying to increase their motivation to return to school by decreasing their motivation to stay home. Okay, now you'll see in the bottom here, there's this term extinction burst. And what that means is that if we are doing something historically with a child, we've been giving them a lot of attention, and then we stop, we in the short term are going to see their problem behavior increase. They may, display more anxiety. They may sometimes threaten to break things like that. And of course, if a child ever threatens to injure themselves, we want to get a risk assessment immediately by a trained professional, whether it's a school-based professional or somewhere else. And so what a lot of parents do is they try this, putting these things, we call it on extinction, or you're not allowed to do these things. The kid's behavior will worsen, the parents kind of give up. The extinction is really a wave that is short term. And if you're seeing it, it's a really good sign. It means that you're effective in figuring out what things are motivating them to, for instance, stay home. Okay, so I want to put that out there for this. As I mentioned, things will get temporarily worse, but we really don't want to have a lot of conversations with the kids about the nature of their problematic behavior, because again, that's giving a lot of attention to the very things that we are hoping to not give a lot of attention to. Okay, so if you're seeing the situation temporarily worsen as you're increasing your firmness, good job. As a parent, that means you're making significant progress towards reentry. Let's go through some other counterintuitive steps here. Let's say, for instance, because parents always say to me, what do you do when a kid is anxious? And so there's a few things that I want to talk about here. So let's say, as an example, there's a kid who's struggling with a math problem, like on this picture here. And no good teacher, no good parent, no good caregiver is going to go over to that kid who's struggling and say, hey, Tommy or Cindy, the answer is 12. Well, why wouldn't you? Because they get the answer right. Well, of course you wouldn't, because they wouldn't learn how to solve the problem. And yet the same thing happens when it comes to coping, is that parents tend to give their kids the coping answer, which unfortunately kind of teaches the kids to seek out proximity to their parents as a way to cope, rather than learning the internal skills themselves. And so we don't want to give them the answer, we want to help them find it. And so I'm going to give you kind of very specific guidance about how to respond to the vast majority of anxious kids' behaviors that are related to their anxiety. So number one is you want to, what we call it, reflective listening. So you want to see what emotion they're exhibiting, and you want to name it. We call this name and contain. So it may be something like, wow, it seems like you're really worried about that test coming up this week. Or it seems like you're really, really anxious about these scary thoughts you're having right now. So you are naming the emotion. That's step number one. Number two is you validate the emotion. It must be really hard to feel that way. That's no fun to have that experience. Okay, so you name it, then you validate it, and then you ask them, in your very best bank teller tone of voice, what they can do besides avoiding that can help them in that situation. Questions like, what can you tell yourself when you feel this way? Is the right question to ask in those circumstances. And in a minute, we'll be going through examples of what some things the kids can tell themselves effectively would be for that situation. So examples of that, I love this quote that courage is never what you feel, it's what you do. That girl who said that she could be anxious and strong at the same time. I asked a younger kid a similar question. He said, I can be scared and brave at the same time. That's the kind of self-coaching that we're looking for here. We want the kids to be able to talk to themselves like their own best friend. And so what we do is we come up with like 5 or so, we call them coping self-statements, which I know is an awkward term, but just kind of things you can tell yourself when you're anxious. And there's no right answers here, but there are some wrong answers. When we're doing these, it's not something where we're looking for a kid to tell themselves, well, they shouldn't be anxious, because that's really invalidating. These can be ways that they're coaching themselves through persisting in the presence of the anxious feelings themselves. I love it when they try and memorize these, and parents, if they're younger, do a pop quiz for small prizes if they can remember all 5 of these. Maybe have them figure out which things they could tell themselves in which situation they're finding themselves in. Here are some examples of some things here. Again, these are just examples. Fear is temporary and harmless. Scary thoughts can't hurt me. Just because I feel scared doesn't mean anything bad's going to happen. Just because I'm scared doesn't mean I can't do it, which is essential, is basically putting a space between the urge to avoid and the decision to avoid, that we can persist in the presence of anxiety. We can overrule and ignore nature's stop sign, and we can continue to pursue our values even through discomfort. Another one that's a big one, I mentioned before, the kids who are afraid of getting sick. So just because I feel sick doesn't mean I'm going to throw up. And the last one I like a lot, especially for younger kids, I'm stronger than my fear. These are all the kinds of things that we want kids to know when they are battling against the urge to avoid. We never want to judge their progress by how much anxiety they're feeling, but on how much they're using avoidance as a way to respond to the anxiety. If they're continuing to do harder things and experiencing anxiety, high fives, fist bumps, hugs, kisses, we want to congratulate them for making that progress in decreasing the use of avoidance. Another thing that parents can do, I mentioned before, bank teller tone of voice. This is the reason why. I want to use an example here. So let's say that you are terrified to fly as an adult, but you win a trip somewhere amazing, and so you decide you're going to go. And you're halfway over the ocean, and you hit a really big turbulence patch, and the plane is bouncing around a great deal. Well, you're going to be very, very scared, and you're going to be looking around the cabin. And I promise you, you're going to be looking at the flight crew to see their faces and how uncomfortable they look in that situation, because you'll assume they're a lot more experienced than you are. Now, I want you to imagine the first scenario where the flight attendant says, hey, everybody, it's going to be fine. Just buckle up. We'll be landing in 2 hours. There's no reason to be nervous. The planes are very, very modern and well-equipped. We can handle this. There's no reason to cry. Everyone, please just calm down. Take a deep breath. It's going to be fine. Example 2, that same flight attendant says, ma'am, would you like tea or coffee with your lunch? One is offering reassurance, and as I mentioned before, doesn't work. It actually validates the need to ask for the reassurance again, and it increases the experience of anxiety over time. The second one is modeling non-anxiety. It's much more effective. I want, as a parent, for you to keep in mind that calm is contagious. Okay, so the more anxious a kid is, the more that we want to reduce. The term we use is expressed emotion towards the kids. Their sinks are already filled to the brim. And if we're pouring our own emotion into that sink, it's going to overflow. And so that's why the bank teller, non-emotional, tea or coffee kind of framework is really important, so we don't make the kids overflow, because these kids are not equipped to be able to handle someone else's expressed emotion. And what I see from families all the time, especially with school avoidance, is the kids are upstairs, they won't get out of the bathroom or out of the bed. Parents are at their wits' end. They're so stressed. Like, you gotta understand, this is so important. You need to go to school. You can't live your life like this. And whatever well-earned emotion you're experiencing, and you are kind of communicating that to the kids, then what happens is they overflow as a consequence. And so it's a really hard skill to master, but it's a really important one for parents of kids who are dealing with these issues to really try that flight attendant, bank teller tone of voice when the kids are very anxious. But, there's even a better question than what do you do when a kid is anxious? Because 80% of what we really do working with anxious kids, and this applies to the school avoiders as well, is what do they do when they're not anxious? How do we help them to learn from what they're doing effectively already? And so when we're doing this as parents of kids dealing with this, is that we want to limit the attention we're giving to the anxiety-based behaviors. Let me give you an analogy. Let's say that you buy this beautiful new home, but it has this flower bed out in front that's totally overrun with these weeds in this picture. They're deeply rooted and really prickly, and you try and pull them, but you just can't get them out. Well, one of the things that you could do, it would be very challenging, but you could do it, is you could water the seeds among the weeds. And if you can do this consistently over time, water the seeds, not the weeds, well, then the weeds will wither and the seeds will grow. That's what we're looking for with these kids. We want to catch them coping in healthy, effective ways that do not include avoidance. And if we can do that effectively, and we try and limit the attention we're giving to the anxiety itself, we're not feeding that dog when it's begging for attention, in other words, then over time, they will learn that they have other ways to get that attention. And it's through effective coping that involves non-avoidance, ways for them to kind of coach themselves through the situation, that they can be anxious and strong at the same time, or they can be scared and brave at the same time, that they are stronger than their fear. They can tell themselves, right now I'm having a scary thought about something that may happen later. That's true, but no one's ever had a fatal thought or a lethal idea. When they are learning that anxiety does not mean avoidance, avoidance is a choice, anxiety never is. And once they learn that that's the path to reduce their suffering, is by reducing their avoidance, even if it increases their suffering in very short-term ways. Once the kids kind of get what I call the owner's manual to their nervous system, when they are able to be an informed observer of their own experience, and they can choose, even at young ages, to pursue their values, not to pursue their comfort. When parents can be lovingly firm and calmly consistent, when we can reduce the competition with school attendance, work closely with mental health professionals and the school to do a rapid return in a gradual way. So you begin, again, parking lot if needed, and then working your way in, but really making boredom our ally at home, and telling kids that, yes, this is hard and we love you and you can do this. We believe in you, that you can be anxious and strong. That is the general approach that we use for these kids. Now, I could talk for 10 hours on this topic. This is only a small scratching of the surface about how to help kids re-enter. I have worked with Carroll County Public Schools on their end about internal approaches and strategies they can be using to help the kids who are dealing with this. And we've seen a ton more of this after the pandemic, as it's not a shock. I mean, everyone can understand that after the kids were online for so long and went through all of the things that they went through with COVID, that we'd be seeing more of this. The good news is these kids can be helped. It takes a community of individuals. It takes excellent communication between treating professionals, the family, the child, and the school. But we can help these kids to return. We need to help these kids to return. Their futures matter. They matter too much to have us in some way helping them avoid school, being complicit with the avoidance, hoping that that will reduce the anxiety. It doesn't. It's doing things while you are anxious that reduces the anxiety. Again, very counterintuitive. The more compassionate the parent is, the more vulnerable they are for getting this wrong. We really try and minimize the use of any home-based learning to treat school avoidance. We think only about 5% of cases is it appropriate. Those cases, again, are if a kid is not safe. So if they're having thoughts of self-injury or worse, if they're experiencing a major mental illness, like they're hearing voices or seeing things, there are exceptions to that. But our number one goal is to reduce the child's suffering by reducing their use of avoidance. I hope this has been helpful. Again, I know it's only a half an hour or so of information, but please, if you're not working with a professional, see someone who's trained in what's called exposure-based therapy. Work closely with the school community to assist with the reentry plan. And just know that you're not alone in this, that there are many, many families. Some estimates are as high as 28% of all kids will avoid school due to mental health concerns. And thankfully, there are treatment options that are available to really help these kids as well. Again, thank you so much for your time, and thank you. Bye-bye.